What you are observing in Washington this week should not be understood merely as a succession of political headlines or the usual cycle of partisan confrontation. From an institutional analysis perspective, it signals something more consequential, a phase in which the American state appears to be recalibrating itself under visible and sustained internal pressure. This is not a moment defined by singular shocks, but by cumulative strain, the kind that slowly alters how systems behave before the public fully recognizes the shift. When analysts examine developments unfolding simultaneously across the U.S. Treasury, the federal court system, housing policy frameworks, and diplomatic signaling toward both allies and adversaries, a coherent pattern begins to surface. What matters most is not any isolated decision, executive order, or legal filing, but the convergence of multiple institutional stress points. Together, these signals suggest that long-standing boundaries between executive authority, federal agencies, and private economic power are no longer assumed to be fixed. Instead, they are being actively probed, reinterpreted, and, in some cases, contested. The prevailing atmosphere in the Capitol is therefore not one of overt disorder, but of managed tension. Government continues to function, procedures are followed, and public messaging remains disciplined. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, there is a growing sense of institutional vigilance. Within federal agencies, internal discussions increasingly revolve less around aspirational policy outcomes and more around durability, around whether the legal, procedural, and ethical guardrails of governance are capable of withstanding prolonged pressure without deformation. This phase marks a clear departure from the theatrics of campaign politics or the early symbolic gestures of a new term. What is unfolding now is quieter, more technical, and far more consequential. It involves process rather than performance, structure rather than spectacle. These are the kinds of shifts that rarely dominate headlines in real time, yet often define political eras in retrospect. Public discourse, however, remains largely anchored to familiar metrics, approval ratings, demographic polarization, and the optics of high-profile public appearances. These elements continue to dominate media narratives because they are visible, quantifiable, and immediately digestible. Institutional analysts, by contrast, emphasize that systems almost always move ahead of the stories told about them. Structural change tends to register first within legal filings, regulatory adjustments, and administrative behavior, long before it is reflected in polling data or public sentiment. As public attention remains focused on surface-level indicators, the deeper machinery of governance, legal frameworks, financial oversight mechanisms, and bureaucratic protocols is quietly processing a series of adaptations. These processes rarely produce dramatic visuals, but they carry implications that extend far beyond the news cycle, shaping how authority is exercised and constrained over the long term. From this analytical standpoint, the central issue is not what is announced at press briefings or emphasized in official statements. It is how institutional norms are being interpreted, tested, and, in some cases, redefined through legal action and administrative practice. This is where the real signal lies, not in the rhetoric of the moment, but in the subtle reconfiguration of how power moves through the American state. Observers across legal, regulatory, and policy communities have increasingly pointed to a notable shift in how the executive branch engages with internal institutional disputes. Rather than being confined to administrative review, internal oversight, or interagency negotiation, these disagreements are more frequently being articulated in explicitly legal terms. This distinction is not merely procedural, it reflects a deeper transformation in how power within the state is asserted, challenged, and defended. When institutional conflict is reframed as a legal matter, it ceases to be an internal management issue and becomes a question of liability, jurisdiction, and precedent. Courts, rather than internal accountability mechanisms, become the arena in which executive authority interacts with the rest of the state. Legal scholars note that this dynamic fundamentally alters the balance between discretion and constraint, shifting influence away from bureaucratic norms and toward adversarial legal interpretation. In late January 2026, multiple media outlets reported on legal actions involving the president, affiliated private entities, and federal agencies responsible for financial oversight. While public attention has often focused on the scale of the claims involved, institutional analysts emphasize that the true significance lies elsewhere. Regardless of the outcome, the mere initiation of such actions introduces new variables into the relationship between executive leadership and the permanent administrative state. By engaging federal agencies through litigation rather than internal review processes, senior executive leadership effectively redefines how disputes within the executive branch are resolved. This approach challenges long-standing assumptions about institutional immunity and internal cohesion, principles that have historically allowed complex bureaucracies to function without constant judicial intervention. Even unsuccessful legal efforts can produce lasting effects by signaling that traditional boundaries are open to contestation. Legal historians have drawn parallels to earlier periods in American governance when executive authority expanded through confrontation rather than consensus. In those moments, courts became instruments not only of dispute resolution, but of structural change. The current dynamic echoes that pattern, suggesting a shift in how executive power is normalized and constrained within the system. From this perspective, the central concern is not the personalization of institutional conflict, nor the motivations of individual actors. It is the precedent being established. Once litigation becomes a normalized tool for managing executive institutional friction, the internal logic of governance changes. Agencies begin to operate not only under statutory mandates, but under the expectation of potential legal exposure from within their own chain of command. The long-term implication is a recalibration of trust inside the executive branch itself. When internal disagreements are externalized into the judicial system, the cohesion that sustains bureaucratic independence weakens. What emerges is not simply a legal dispute, but a structural shift in how authority, accountability, and autonomy are understood within the American state. This dynamic introduces a form of internal risk management that is rarely visible to the public. Legal and compliance divisions are no longer focused solely on external challenges, but on managing uncertainty originating from within the executive hierarchy itself. The result is a system operating defensively, prioritizing institutional insulation and continuity over discretionary initiative. While this approach reduces immediate volatility, it can also slow decision-making and narrow the space for independent bureaucratic judgment. Congressional reactions reflect a similar shift in focus. Beyond partisan positioning, there is a growing emphasis on institutional preservation. Lawmakers across committees have raised concerns not primarily about policy outcomes, but about precedent, specifically how executive actions may alter the mechanisms through which disputes between branches or within the executive itself are resolved. For many institutional observers, the central question is not whether a particular action succeeds, but whether it changes the rules governing future interactions between elected leadership and the permanent state. From this perspective, Congress's role is increasingly defensive rather than proactive. Oversight efforts are framed less as political opposition and more as attempts to reinforce structural boundaries that have historically stabilized the system. This reflects an understanding that precedents established during periods of heightened executive assertiveness tend to outlast the administrations that create them. Financial markets and housing sector analysts have also closely monitored recent executive directives aimed at recalibrating the balance between large institutional investors and individual homebuyers. Policies presented as protections for owner-occupants mark a departure from market arrangements that have shaped the housing sector since the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. For more than a decade, institutional capital has played a central role in sustaining liquidity and price stability in residential real estate. Supporters of these directives argue that they correct long-standing distortions, restoring access and affordability for first-time buyers and reducing speculative pressure. Critics counter that restricting institutional participation risks disrupting capital flows that have become deeply embedded in housing finance. From an institutional standpoint, however, the significance lies less in the policy debate itself and more in the method. Executive authority is being applied more directly to shape economic outcomes that were previously mediated through market dynamics and legislative compromise. This approach introduces a new layer of systemic risk management. By intervening at the executive level, the administration assumes greater responsibility for downstream consequences, from credit availability to construction incentives and price volatility. Institutions across the financial and regulatory spectrum are therefore recalibrating their exposure, adjusting expectations in anticipation of a more interventionist executive posture. Taken together, these responses suggest a system prioritizing containment over expansion. Institutions are not openly resisting executive direction, but they are adapting defensively, reinforcing internal controls and reassessing risk. This is the hallmark of a governance environment in which continuity is preserved not through confidence, but through caution. Taken together, these developments point to a broader and more systemic pattern. Executive authority, increasingly deployed not only as a tool of governance, but as a form of legal and economic leverage. This shift does not, by itself, establish intent, motive, or ultimate outcome. What it does reveal is a departure from a long-standing assumption embedded in the American system, that the federal bureaucracy operates as a neutral, semi-autonomous, stabilizing force, largely insulated from the personal or political priorities of any single administration. Institutional analysts stress that this reading does not rely on claims of conspiracy, coordination, or hidden agendas. Instead, it is grounded in observable structural effects. When executive leadership bypasses traditional agency processes, challenges internal authority through legal mechanisms, or exposes federal institutions to direct liability, the functional role of those agencies begins to change. Their capacity to act as buffers, absorbing political pressure, moderating policy swings, and maintaining continuity, is gradually reduced. As those buffering mechanisms weaken, institutional turbulence becomes more likely. Decision-making slows, risk aversion increases, and agencies recalibrate their behavior in anticipation of heightened scrutiny or intervention. This turbulence is not necessarily chaotic, but it is destabilizing in subtler ways. It introduces uncertainty into systems designed to operate on predictability, from regulatory enforcement to market oversight. That uncertainty, in turn, can serve as justification for further executive involvement. When existing institutions appear less capable of managing complexity or maintaining stability, the case for direct executive action strengthens. What emerges is a self-reinforcing dynamic. Intervention produces stress. Stress produces perceived dysfunction, and perceived dysfunction legitimizes additional intervention. Over time, this feedback loop alters the practical boundaries of authority without requiring formal changes to law or constitutional structure. Markets respond to this environment not through ideology, but through risk assessment. As executive action becomes a more prominent driver of economic outcomes, market actors adjust expectations, reprice assets, and hedge against policy volatility. Narrative control also shifts. Instead of policy debates being framed primarily around legislation or regulation, they increasingly center on executive decisions and their immediate effects. This concentrates both responsibility and visibility at the top of the system. The cumulative effect is not the collapse of institutional governance, but its gradual reorientation. Power becomes more centralized, more reactive, and more closely tied to executive discretion. The system continues to function, but under a different internal logic, one in which stability is maintained not by institutional autonomy, but by continual intervention. This is how governance changes in practice, not through a single decisive break, but through a sequence of adaptations that, over time, redefine how authority is exercised, how markets respond, and how the public narrative is shaped. Media, soft power, and institutional image separate but closely related concerns have emerged around the evolving relationship between political authority, media production, and global corporate platforms. In recent years, high-profile media projects involving political figures have drawn renewed attention to how public office increasingly intersects with private branding, intellectual property, and commercial licensing, while public debate often gravitates toward cultural reaction or personal optics. Institutional analysts focus on the deeper structural implications of this convergence. From an institutional perspective, the core issue is not the content of any particular media project, nor the public reception it generates. The concern lies in precedent. When political identity becomes embedded within globally distributed entertainment ecosystems, it introduces a new channel through which power, legitimacy, and narrative influence are projected internationally. Unlike traditional public diplomacy, this form of projection operates largely outside the frameworks of diplomatic protocol, regulatory oversight, or institutional accountability. Historically, the image of the American presidency and its associated figures has been managed through formal state mechanisms, press offices, diplomatic engagements, and carefully mediated cultural exchanges. The current environment departs from that model. Global entertainment corporations now possess the infrastructure to disseminate political imagery at a scale and speed that rival, and in some cases surpass, official state channels. This shifts narrative influence away from institutions and toward market-driven platforms whose primary obligations are commercial rather than civic. The result is an emergent form of soft power that is simultaneously informal and far-reaching. It does not require authorization from foreign ministries, nor does it align neatly with stated policy objectives. Yet it remains closely associated with political authority, benefiting from the symbolic weight of public office while operating under private contractual arrangements. This blurring of boundaries complicates traditional distinctions between state representation and private enterprise. Institutional analysts note that this dynamic can reshape international perception in subtle but lasting ways. Foreign audiences may engage with political figures not through official statements or diplomatic actions, but through curated narratives designed for entertainment and brand positioning. Over time, this can recalibrate how legitimacy is constructed, shifting it from institutional credibility to visibility and market penetration. What makes this development particularly consequential is its durability. Media products persist long after political cycles end, creating a form of narrative continuity that outlives policy decisions and electoral outcomes. As a result, the institutional image of political authority becomes partially decoupled from the state itself, residing instead within global cultural and commercial systems. This does not represent a collapse of institutional soft power, but a parallel track, one that operates independently of traditional governance while remaining deeply intertwined with political identity. The long-term implication is a redefinition of how influence is generated, maintained, and perceived in an era where media infrastructure rivals state institutions in its ability to shape global narratives. On the international stage, recent rhetoric and policy signals directed toward Iran, Canada, and broader trade relationships have been interpreted by analysts as part of a wider strategic posture centered on pressure, leverage, and transactional alignment. Rather than emphasizing predictability or long-term consensus building, these signals reflect a foreign policy approach that prioritizes flexibility and immediate bargaining power. The objective, from this analytical perspective, appears less about formal doctrine and more about maintaining strategic optionality. Statements that encourage internal political change within foreign states, when paired with assertive trade positioning toward long-standing allies, introduce a deliberate degree of strategic ambiguity. Such ambiguity can serve as a tool of influence, forcing counterpart governments to reassess assumptions and prepare for multiple scenarios. At the same time, it places intelligence, defense, and diplomatic institutions in a complex position. They must plan for contingencies that may not be anchored to clearly articulated diplomatic strategies or formal policy commitments. For security institutions, this creates a planning environment defined by uncertainty rather than alignment. Intelligence agencies are tasked with distinguishing rhetorical signaling from actionable intent, while defense planners must consider escalation pathways that may never materialize. Diplomatic channels, meanwhile, operate under the challenge of managing alliances when official messaging is fluid and subject to rapid recalibration. The result is a foreign policy apparatus operating with heightened alertness but reduced clarity. In the North American context, trade tensions linked to China policy and defense cooperation have amplified questions about alliance durability. Long-standing assumptions about coordination and mutual accommodation are being tested by a more conditional framework, one in which economic access, security collaboration, and political alignment are increasingly interlinked. Canadian officials, in response, have publicly emphasized national sovereignty and economic independence, signaling clear boundaries to pressure-based engagement. Institutional analysts observe that while this approach can generate short-term leverage, particularly in negotiations, it carries longer-term costs. Alliances depend not only on shared interests, but on reliability and trust. When partners perceive commitments as contingent or transactional, they begin to hedge, diversifying economic ties, reassessing defense dependencies, and recalibrating diplomatic posture. These adaptations may be gradual, but they tend to persist. From a structural standpoint, the risk is not immediate rupture, but cumulative drift. Strategic ambiguity can be effective as a temporary tactic, but when sustained, it alters how allies and adversaries alike interpret signals from Washington. Over time, this can erode the informal understandings that have underpinned alliance cohesion and deterrent stability for decades. What emerges then is a foreign policy environment shaped less by formal declarations and more by inferred intent. Power is exercised through implication as much as action. While this model maximizes executive flexibility, it also redistributes risk across the broader institutional system, requiring allies, markets, and security establishments to absorb uncertainty that was once managed through predictability and shared frameworks. Historically, the United States has undergone several periods of institutional realignment, from the constitutional rupture of the Civil War era to the expansive administrative restructuring of the New Deal. In each case, the balance between executive authority, institutional autonomy, and market forces was renegotiated over time. What distinguishes the current moment is not simply the presence of expansion, but the speed and method through which executive power now interacts with established norms. Rather than unfolding through gradual legislative reform or broad constitutional debate, change is increasingly taking shape through litigation, executive orders, and direct market intervention. These mechanisms accelerate institutional adaptation, allowing authority to be exercised with immediacy. At the same time, they compress deliberation and increase systemic volatility. Institutions are forced to adjust in real time, often without the stabilizing buffer of consensus or precedent. From an institutional standpoint, the deeper question is not one of ideological alignment or political preference. It is a question of resilience. How much strain can governance structures absorb before their stabilizing function begins to erode? And at what point does adaptation become transformation? When executive leadership engages the state simultaneously through legal confrontation, market restructuring, and media-driven influence, the underlying definition of governance begins to shift. Institutions designed to operate as foundations of continuity risk being reframed as obstacles to executive intent. Markets once treated as neutral mechanisms of allocation become instruments of policy enforcement. Narrative power, traditionally managed through public institutions, increasingly migrates toward private platforms. The long-term implications of this convergence remain uncertain. Courts will test the legal boundaries of executive action. Markets will respond by recalibrating risk and capital allocation. Alliances will reassess reliability and strategic alignment. Together, these systems will determine whether this period produces a more adaptive and responsive state, or a more fragmented and internally strained one. What is increasingly clear is that this moment cannot be fully understood through daily headlines, polling data, or isolated controversies. The real story unfolds more slowly, at the structural level, where legal precedent, institutional behavior, and strategic perception intersect. This is where power is being redefined, quietly, incrementally, and often out of public view. That is the signal beneath the noise. If you want to understand how these structural shifts continue to shape American power, beyond personalities and political cycles, subscribe to U.S. Power Report. Share your perspective in the comments. Do you see this moment as a necessary adaptation or the early signs of institutional overreach? In our next analysis, we will examine how the geographic reconfiguration of American defense manufacturing is quietly reshaping political influence across the Midwest and redefining the domestic foundations of U.S. power.